Good morning, everybody. Tara here with a Wifey Wake Up podcast. And at least if you're in the central time zone, we are still in the morning. Had a busy morning this morning, everybody. So sorry for the late start, but let's get rolling. I have a great topic for you today. So Wifey School is really based upon my experience of 20 some years of marriage and the hurdles and the challenges that I've gone through, and of course my husband as well, but from my perspective and how I and we got through them. And the point is to help you. It's inevitable that you're going to go through challenges in life and in marriage. And I want to help you to get through those with more ease and hopefully faster, and that you can gain the insight faster so that you can move on with life. So that is definitely one of today's topics, fits solidly within those parameters. And we are talking about why husbands resist counseling, understanding the male perspective on therapy. And I think many women and men have been through this process who have been married, and maybe some who aren't married yet, but going through premarital counseling or or just in a long-term relationship and are faced with this situation. And it is not uncommon that men just flat out don't want to go to the counselor or the therapist, whichever it may be. And I want to provide some insight as to why that may be, because if your wife, like me, who was in this situation, you just don't understand why they wouldn't even want to go to counseling, right? Because you're in this relationship together. Aren't we in life in the same boat? Why won't you do this with me? And most of the time they're not going to tell you, or if they do, it's hard to hear why he won't go to a counselor with you. Now, it's very likely that you've already been to a counselor together, and it's actually what happened in that session. You might have thought it was just fine, like you were getting the ball rolling, and all of a sudden, or maybe not so all of a sudden, he's like, nope, I'm done, no more. And you're like, we just got started. So here's the inside scoop, ladies, okay? Is that you may have felt like you were on a roll. You were going, headed in a good direction, but the therapy realm and counseling realm is so dominated by female thought and females themselves that is highly dominated. It's going to be highly tilted towards that perspective. And so, especially if you have already gone into counseling together and you thought the ball was rolling in the right direction, and then he takes a hard out, that's usually why, is because they feel that not only are they going in and facing the same challenges that he had with you, but likely there's another woman, or at least a very perspective that is highly sided towards the woman, and that he is not heard in that situation. And if you haven't been to counseling yet, and maybe you have an appointment, good for you. Keep that in mind, okay? And cutting to the chase here, the best thing that you can do for your relationship, not only in the counselor's office or the therapist's office, is keep in mind the top priority is your relationship. So often we go in and we want to have our side heard. We want to be validated. We want our side to be right. But especially if you want to stay married, assuming that that is the goal, you want to go with that as your primary goal. And so that is listening to each other. And this is step number one. Because if you can listen to this, maybe he tried to convey this, but it just didn't quite sink in, because of course you wanted to be heard, right? And I'm not pointing the finger at you. When I say you, I mean me. I've been there as well. And so it's so imperative that if you go somewhere, that you keep in mind that the marriage is the primary client, let's say, and that you two are in that office, in that session, trying to figure out how to get back on track for the marriage. And part of that will be each of you being heard and each of you presenting your case. But remember, you're fighting, and you're fighting in the same direction, on the same team. You're in the same boat, rowing in the same direction. And there's going to be some turbulence. There's going to be some waves that you encounter. But if you keep that in mind, that will help you go so far. Even if you're not sure, even if you feel that you're at the end of your rope and you're wondering, I don't know if we're going to remain in this relationship. For sure, if you are just fighting for your own perspective, it's going to more likely tear you apart. And so if there's even an inkling that you want to remain together, I would highly encourage you to keep your relationship number one and remember that that's the primary client that you're fighting for. So I kind of skipped to the chase there. There's a little bit more to fill in the gaps, but there you've got it in 5 minutes. Why men resist counseling. It's not all men, but I'd also like to point out that if you have gone through that scenario and he's resisting or just flat out, left the counseling session, and you might even validate this with him, that it's actually a good sign that he's standing up for himself. If he doesn't feel that he's being heard or has an advocate, that it's a good sign, it's a healthy sign, right? If your girlfriend said, I went to this, whatever it may be, but let's just say a counseling session with someone, or maybe they had a dispute with someone and she felt that she wasn't being heard and she walked out, you'd probably say, good for you. If you didn't feel that you were being fairly represented or heard in that situation, then why be there? And so it actually is a sign of a healthy individual who's standing up for themselves to not be involved in a situation where they feel outnumbered, not even considered in the situation. So I'm going to share a few very personal experiences. I mean, they're very personal to me, obviously, just to hopefully illustrate this point a little bit more. So again, all this wifey school teaching is based on experience. It's of course, years of reading books and applying it to our marriage, but it's not just statistics and hyperbole. So it was a good about 10 years into our marriage that we really hit a rough patch, as they say. And we were like independently and mutually going through a really rough time. My husband was having a really rough time in business, and I'm going to spare you some of the details, not just because they're personal, but they don't really particularly matter in this case. And then I was going through a very rough time as well. I had really been coming to the point of realizing that my family of origin was not going to be in my life anymore. And I was essentially going through a very terrible breakup with my family of origin. And I mean specifically, to illustrate this, I had been having several years of dispute with my parents in particular, and my sisters, who were teenagers at the time, or in their early 20s, were kind of by default part of this. And I learned that my mother was unofficially diagnosed as borderline personality. And I say unofficially because she only went to one of those counseling sessions, and I remained going to that counselor. And they said, well, she's not continuing with me any longer, but I would say she really shows a sign of borderline personality disorder. And I looked that up, and boy, did she fit the bill. And, people are much more familiar with psychological terms these days. So I'll just say, if you don't know what borderline personality is, if you just extreme narcissism, they're very far on that scale. And they're notorious for not going to counseling. So this is not related to my husband in a sense, because this was just something I was going through in life. And at the same time, my dad wouldn't stand up to her and say, this is not right. What you're doing is absolutely horrendous, and actually put me in the position to say that you have to heal this, which with someone who won't even go to counselor and is outright doing very destructive things and knowingly doing so, there's really no healing with them. So it was at a time that I was realizing that familiar family of origin was no longer going to be a part of my life, including my sisters likely. And I didn't know at that time which family members were a part of this, so to speak, were kind of followed the same thought process. And so it was an absolutely devastating time. And in addition to that, the future that I had anticipated was not coming to fruition. And so what it felt like is I was on this tiny island, because of course when you're in grief and you're lamenting, your sense of self kind of shrinks down to a very narrow sense of yourself. And so I felt like I was on this very small island all to myself, and I couldn't go back and revisit, anyone from my recent past, nor could I did not feel like I could create the future, not only that I envisioned or wanted, but it really felt like nothing could come to fruition. So it was extremely frustrating for me. And at the same time, like I said, my husband was going through some, business can be challenging and life can be challenging by itself, but some particularly challenging times. And what I came to understand, and it took me a long time to understand this, and this is the point of wifey school, is when you're in the thick of it, it's hard to see from someone else's perspective. And it's already difficult because you're not them, right? And if you're a man and a woman, it's already because you think very differently. And then, of course, if you're have a lot of big emotions that are overcoming you, it's even more difficult to see from their position. And what I didn't realize is that not only was my husband going through his own big challenges, I didn't understand the degree of those challenges in business. And then also that me being sad and upset that things weren't coming to fruition that I saw anticipated would be coming to fruition in our life, and me being upset or just commenting about it made it even worse for him, because he was doing what he was doing in life and in business, not only to support us on a day-to-day basis, but he was doing his best to do that for our future. And me being discontented just added salt to the wound, and what was the other, fuel to the fire of his own emotions. And so we were both kind of in our own stew pots and just steaming and just ready to go off at any moment. And so having any kind of productive discussion was really difficult, because it was more like, I was like, I feel this way, I'm discontented this way. And he doesn't really express himself that way, but he was more like just this is the salt on the wound, right? And the fuel to the fire of the emotions that are already brewing. So I really needed to paint that scene just for you to understand, if you're listening to this, you may be in a similar circumstance where you're just both separately just kind of brewing in your own stew pots or percolators, let's say, and you just one little touch and you just go off, right? So I was desperately looking for some solutions. And of course, why wouldn't a therapist, a counselor, be a solution? And so I sought out someone local that I thought was a great candidate. This was before, online counseling was very popular and available. And so we saw someone local who, by her credentials online, looked very credible, very qualified. And we went, and I thought it was going great. And then I find that, my husband is being very resistant. And here I'm sitting, on the couch thinking, okay, do I just have a really just like chronically resistant husband? Does he not want to work things out? What's going on here? And fortunately, I was even more upset then, right? Because it was like, here I'm trying to work on a solution, and now there's another seemingly bigger problem. And that's that my husband won't work with me here in a counseling situation. So fortunately, I was able to still kind of separate myself a bit from the situation and not just be all consumed by all the emotions that I was feeling, and actually kind of take a third person perspective and go, what is actually going on here? And something that really stood out to me, because I had to assess, I'm like, okay, is it truly that my husband is really a difficult person? And he can be. But I think anyone who has standards for how they are treated and standards for their life and has something to lose they feel that they have something to lose, they're probably going to be pretty difficult about allowing someone else to have influence over their situation. And fortunately, I was able to take this kind of third person perspective and go, okay, what is really going on here? Is there really a deep-seated challenge issue between me and my husband? Is this person actually kind of revealing something greater than I need to see? And something that really stood out to me, and there was a few more things that stood out to my husband. He's like, yeah, name this, and this. But was the one thing that really stood out to me is she said at one point, wow, I really could not be married to your husband or married to him, something like that. I don't think I said something at the time, but I remember thinking then, and that was definitely something I contemplated later and was a reason for not going back, is that, of course, right? I mean, I already knew plenty of women who were attracted to my husband and knew that they couldn't handle him. It's just like there's certain energies that work and don't work. And of course, we weren't working great at that time either. But it was kind of a ridiculous comment for a therapist to say. And this is something I forgot to point out earlier, is that, therapists are, except for, depends on their approach, but generally supposed to be more neutral, especially in a couples session. This is why typically, and I don't know if this is a part of a licensed therapist, licensure, so forth, but typically they're not going to see you as a couple and then see one of the individuals on the side. You either see them as an individual or you see them as a couple, because they'll tend to form, very naturally, you'll tend to form a bias for the person that you're seeing additionally as a client. So typically you go either seeing them as an individual or you both see them as a couple. And so this really stood out to me, that she was showing her own bias, that she's like, I just couldn't be married to your husband. Well, how is she going to help us work on our marriage if she already sees him being impossible to work with from her point of view, right? And so it was very challenging, because I really, I had high hopes and had already, gone through a number of sessions, paid so much money, and it kind of seems like, okay, that was money not so well spent. But I learned a couple of very valuable things. And that was, first of all, when you hire someone, you have to be on the same page also about what is the objective that because you're literally hiring the therapist to work for you. And it's just like if you're going to remodel your home or redecorate or something, you want to have a plan of what your outcome is going to be. And yeah, the outcome, you might come in saying, oh, we'd like to get over this rift, right? But really, if assuming you're married, your plan is either to work it out or not. There's no in between, because that's horrible, right? You have to have some kind of objective to either we need to sort this out and prioritize our relationship and maybe get to a new stage of our relationship and come to some kind of resolution, get to the bottom of this and come to some resolution so that we can live in a happy or at least contented way again, or we're dissolving this relationship and we need mediation and help in working this out. I don't think there's really any in between ground. And you have to be really careful that going into these situations that you're not just going in to only have your side heard. And that is the biggest challenge that I hear that men face. And certainly I've experienced that as well in our own counseling sessions. And because of course, as a woman, if you went into a session and you're like, what, they're just taking his side. Like, what's the deal here? Can't I be heard? You would be very upset and want to leave as well. So that's why I think number one needs to be prioritizing the relationship, that is the number one client, not either of you. The other story that I have is, so around that time, of course, after that one therapist, I was like, well, I'm not going to give up on therapists. Maybe I just found the wrong one, right? And I thought, clearly, my husband, like I've said in other podcasts, he's a very good communicator. He's very clear. And he said, I'm not being heard. I'm being vilified, and our marriage is not being put in its proper place. That is, that the counselor was clearly more for you being heard, the woman, than both of us, at least. And definitely she did not seem like she was for our marriage. She, just by like the previous statements that I said. So I thought, okay, I'll look for someone else. Maybe I'll look for a man. A couple would be ideal. Well, finding a couple who is a couples counselor, at least then, was rather challenging, especially if you're not doing online stuff. But I did finally find a couple. I think they were in their 60s. I think he had been a counselor for years, and then she had been in education, I believe, and later came into the counseling realm. And they would work individually, and then on some situations like mine would come together. And so I thought, oh, yes, I found the couple. So I went by myself just to kind of get a feel for the situation. And it's really too bad. Like when you build yourself up, you have these hopes of like, okay, I think I found the one. And I went in, and they started listening to me, and I just could feel that they weren't on the same page. It was almost like they had had a recent argument, and that kind of feeling, it was like that was stirring up the feeling in them. And I don't know if you've ever watched a movie, for example, of a situation that you've been in, and it stirs up those feelings again. It was almost like me coming in was stirring up similar situations and feelings in them that not only they had encountered, but they were still dealing with. And it was just a feeling, but I went away knowing that I couldn't go back. Like I couldn't bring my husband in because he would definitely sense it, and they wouldn't have enough resources. They wouldn't have the resources to help us. So that was really disappointing, to say the least. So all that is to say, just with a few examples in there, that ladies, I know it can be hard to hear that the reason that he may be resisting or flat out just not going to counseling or therapy is because he's not feeling heard. He's typically not, guys don't really speak in that language, like, well, I'm not feeling heard, so I'm not going to go. We would say that with our girlfriends, right? So if he has expressed it to you, it probably didn't come out in that way. And if that point even did come across, and maybe you're just realizing it now by me saying it this way, it can be hard to take in. And what I'd really encourage you to do is just to sit back for a while and imagine being in his position, and that a person's reality, how they perceive it, is their reality. Okay? It might not be the actual reality, but just imagine for a second that is his reality, that he is feeling ganged up on, that is only the woman's point of view that is not only being heard, but is then being enforced back onto the situation. And that what he's worked so hard for, and what you both really have worked hard for, but what he's trying to maintain is his position in the family. And if he's giving up authority to the counselor, he's acquiescing any kind of authority that he has in the family. And that is, for a man that has boundaries, that has standards, that is a quality man, that is very difficult, if not impossible. And so my next podcast is going to be about what do you do next, right? But I purposely separated these, not only because I'm already at 24 minutes, there's plenty to say just on this topic, but it requires you first to consider his position, that he is not feeling heard. Again, he's not going to likely say that because guys don't speak in feeling languages typically. But just consider for a moment that if he is feeling that he's not only not being heard, but it feels like he's getting ganged up on, and therefore it's there's nothing productive that can come out of it in his mind. That's why he is resisting and or is not going. It is, he's damned if he doesn't, and damned if he does and damned if he doesn't, right? Damned if I do, damned if I don't. That's usually how it's said. And so he's like, well, I'll stick with the current situation that I know and, is not working great, but at least it's predictable. I know what's going to come around the corner typically. So I really encourage you ladies to take a couple days, and it might, take some time. You don't have to take a trip or anything like that, but just maybe like go for some more walks, take a bath, go work out, and just contemplate this. And the thing is, it's very, very worth it. It's very worth taking this time that is free. You're not paying for a counselor. And, you don't have to spend money, like I said, going on a trip. You just take the time and consider, if I were in his shoes, might I feel similar? Even as a woman, even though you can't 100% think like a guy. And I would say, when I contemplated this, I thought, okay, I guess I can see where he's coming from and why this is such an issue for him. And gradually, I was able to find other solutions to help us get through this. Because, again, if you're not fighting for your marriage, you're not fighting for your marriage. And it took me a lot to get to this point. So I encourage you to take that time to think about it. And the next podcast will be about what you can do next once you have accepted that, yeah, perhaps his feelings, I'm going to accept his feelings as valid. And I'm going to take the next step that I can do to help the situation and go from there. Because men, fortunately, as they say, women are very complicated. Men are simple. Thank God. Usually when these next things that I'm going to share with you, probably tomorrow, once you start doing them, it's kind of like clockwork in a way. By clockwork, I mean just like a tick in one direction. It's very predictable. He responds typically very readily if he doesn't feel overly protected or wounded on the inside. So I'm especially excited to get off to that next point. But the prerequisite, number one, is you have to at least, for the meantime, consider and accept that his feelings of being ganged up on, honestly, is what it comes down to, are valid. Okay? So I would love to hear what you have to say on this one, guys and ladies. This is a big topic because I think we all go through it in our relationships at one point or another. And the thing is, that's what's so great. We're men and women, we're different. That's what's wonderful. And then until it becomes an issue, right? So let me know your thoughts. Please like, subscribe, share this with a friend who comes to mind that might benefit or enjoy this. And down below, I do have a link where you could book a session with me. Send a quick question. There are a couple ways to do that. And I'd love to help you out too, because I know how tough this can be. And sometimes counselors can be great, and sometimes you just need to talk to people who've just been through it and can see both sides, can see the before and after. Okay. Have a wonderful day, everybody. And oh, by the way, there's also a tip jar down there. Would appreciate if you found this helpful. You can leave a tip there, whether it means I can take my bestie, that's my husband, out to coffee, out to lunch, out to dinner. We'd really appreciate that too. So take care, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.